Hey adventurers, so today is going to be another book review. This is going to be For Arthur by Stephen R. Lawhead. So this is the third book in the Pendragon Cycle. Once again, this is Arthurian, obviously. Arthur is in the title. It's historical fantasy. Once again, very much like the other two books that I have reviewed at this point. It's historical fantasy. It's religious. Basically all the same things that go along with most Arthurian stories are also part of this. So it is fantasy, but it's also historical. There's a lot of historical accuracies tied into it, characters, moments, events, dates, stuff like that. Well, less dates, but events, and a lot of religious themes going on as well, and stuff with that, because there's part of the intention with this retelling is to retell it from a Christian perspective. So as I just mentioned, Arthur is book 3 of the Pendragon Cycle by Stephen R. Lawhead. This book acts like an ending to the series in many ways, even though there are 2 more books after that take place after the events of Arthur. This book is constructed differently than any of the other books in the series and actually makes more linear sense than any of the others do, which is kind of weird. Maybe not more linear sense, but at least, or than any other book in the series, but at least more than Merlin and Taliesin did. Those ones, it's very hard to get a sense of how much time is passing, whereas with Arthur, it makes a little bit more sense. It's a little bit clearer. Before I continue with this review, though, I just quickly like to say, if you're liking what you're seeing from an Erudite adventure, please like, comment, and subscribe. I've also been told that I should introduce myself a little bit better, so I will do that now as well. I should have done it at the beginning, but I didn't. Anyways, I'm T. This is an Erudite adventure. We will continue now. This book tells, unsurprisingly based on the title, the story of Arthur. Though his birth was told at the end of Merlin, it really isn't until this book that we begin to learn about him as a character. We do a little bit in Merlin, but it's very brief. It's the very end of that book is just setting up Arthur's story. It is here that we start out once again with the sword in the stone and the reaction thereto, which that's understandably and rightly so a very important moment in the Arthurian myth, is Arthur drawing the sword from the stone, showing that he is the rightful king. And so that's something that we once again show here. We show it through a different perspective. I believe, if I remember correctly, it is shown in Merlin, at the end of Merlin as well, but it's done again and from the viewpoint of different characters, or their perceptions of what's going on, at least, than it was in Merlin. And so we kind of get these 2 angles of this event and what it means to the people. Arthur is forced to prove himself time and time again until he is at last accepted as the rightful king. In this way, it is just like so many of the other Arthurian tales, which I definitely think is a good thing. But this book splits his story into 3 parts, which I will talk about. I'll break down that a little bit more, because this was a hard review for me to write, actually, quite honestly. Part of it was because I don't remember what events take place in this book versus in Pendragon and Grail. I do with Grail, but with Pendragon, there's some, I can't quite remember what events take place in Pendragon that were not in Arthur, and vice versa. Each of these 3 parts, though, is told from a different perspective by someone who is around to witness his journey during those times. So one of his companions, or one of the characters that was following him and seeing what was doing, chronicling his life, essentially. We never get the story told through the eyes of Arthur himself. Each of these POVs shows Arthur through different eyes and different perspectives on him. First off, with Peleus, who is traditionally a knight of Camelot, though here in this book, instead of being a knight of Camelot, he is a servant to Merlin. He's one of the people who worked closely with Merlin, who was a servant to him, who followed him around, learned from Merlin, and he's looking back at this section of Arthur's life, obviously being able to recount that part of his life because he was there with Merlin watching it, type thing. And so, of course, in this way, his view of Arthur is very similar to that which we would get from Merlin. And he tells the story of a young Arthur having just pulled the sword from the stone and being forced to convince the world he is who he claims to be and that he can be a king. And so this involves battles and stuff like that. And there's a lot that goes on with that, of him proving that he is the rightful king. Part 2 then is told by Bedwyr, or Bedivere as he's usually known in the Arthurian tales. This is a character that traditionally is one of Arthur's greatest knights. Until the introduction of Lancelot, where he's kind of pushed to the side, Bedivere and Gawain are basically Arthur's strongest knights. Like those are the main characters of the Arthurian tales up until the introduction of Lancelot, and where they then get pushed aside. Gawain still has a little bit, especially with the inclusion of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, that tale into the story. It allows Gawain to remain as a major player, even though Bedivere is kind of pushed aside. But Bedivere is also the knight who Arthur, at the end of his life, Arthur commands to throw Excalibur back into the lake, and Bedivere goes and it's like, I should throw it, but I can't do it. And so he goes back to Arthur, and Arthur asks, did you do it? And he says, no, I didn't do it. And so he says, go do it. And so he goes back, and I think it's like 3 times that Arthur tells Bedivere to go throw the sword in the lake. And eventually the last time he finally does. But that's a different story. Anyways, that is not the story being told in Arthur, although there's various aspects from the character that we know of as Bedivere being tied into this Bedwyr story, and his perspective and his retelling of this section of the life of Arthur, that was a lot of rambling to say very shortly, that though that's not his story here, yes, he is a knight, but he is used here to show a more established King Arthur seeking to establish the Round Table and protect Britain from the Saxons. So he's one of Arthur's commanders, one of the people that works really closely with Arthur to help the kingdom of Britain, the kingdom of Summer, as it's called in this series, from destruction. Helps keep peace in the land, and he watches as Arthur is that leader that the kingdom needs. Part 3 is told by Aneirin, or Gildas. So apparently Gildas is a character who is a historical character, and in this series, let's see, Gildas, who is a poet from history and is looking back once more, telling the remainder of the tale of Arthur. Okay, Gildas is a poet from history, and so like an actual historical character, it seems to, from what I was understanding doing the brief research that I did. And in this series, Aneirin is his name, and then he changes it to Gildas after the death of Arthur. From what I understand, based on what I was reading about this series and just about who this character was in history and stuff like that. But basically, he's a poet from history, but he's not a character that is super well known in the Arthurian lore. I don't recognize him from Arthurian lore. I didn't recognize Taliesin from Arthurian lore either, and that's a character who is actually heavily referenced in Arthurian lore, apparently. Anyways, continuing. Here, though, Aneirin is looking back and once more telling the remainder of the tale of Arthur from the betrayal of Medrawt, or Mordred in this series' version of Mordred, and the fall of Arthur. That was okay. Let me read that again so that it's a little bit more clear. Aneirin is here looking back, once more telling the remainder of the tale of Arthur from the betrayal of Medrawt, or Mordred, and the fall of Arthur. So that he's wrapping up this tale of Arthur. The book is essentially the grand story of Arthur's life and reign, viewed in 3 different snapshots. I greatly enjoyed this one as well, though I do feel like you miss a lot of the events due to the way that it's constructed, due to the way that it's 3 snapshots of his life with significant chunks of time passing in between, major events passing in between, and stuff like that. And even with all that, though, I do think it works well with the story being told. And let me continue here because I clarify my thoughts a little bit with this. That, though, is why the remaining 2 books in the series exist, meaning Pendragon and Grail, so that you can learn more about the reign of Arthur rather than just see his establishment, the height of his kingdom, and then the fall. All those 3 things are very, very necessary parts of the Arthurian tale, and for the story being told with this series, those are the appropriate sections to tell of his story within the book Arthur. And so it was the right choice to tell those 3 portions of the story in this book, even though we feel like we're missing out on so many other events and details, which are then we have the opportunity to go back and fill in and flesh out some of those details in those other 2 remaining books. This one, I like I said, I greatly enjoyed it. It's not as good as Taliesin or Merlin for me, but I still found it to be very enjoyable, and just being back in Arthurian literature is so refreshing in many ways, and it's just so nice for me to be reading Arthurian literature and enjoying it, and especially the way that I did this series, where I did binge the entire series, which is part of my problem with remembering what events go in which order and stuff like that. But I did greatly enjoy this book as well. It definitely not as much as Taliesin or Merlin. I think it's probably place 3 in the series. I think it goes for my, I think my ranking currently of these 3 books is Taliesin, Merlin, Arthur, in that order. So publication order, chronological order, whatever you want to say. Those 3 books, book 1 through 3, are at place 1 through 3 as well. That changes a little bit with the other 2 books in the series. But anyways, that is all I have to say about Arthur. Thank you guys for watching an Erudite Adventure. We post videos every Monday and Thursday at the moment, and we will see you guys again soon. Stay warm.